If you grew up in Britain between 1952 and the 1980s, there was a good chance you had one on your bedroom floor. The little polythene bag of grey plastic parts, the instruction sheet, the tube of glue, the Humbrol paints. Building an Airfix kit was as British as fish and chips. And the company that made them was founded by a Hungarian refugee who started out making rubber beach balls and plastic combs. One accidental tractor commission built a hobby empire producing 20 million kits a year. Then it collapsed not once but twice, saving it cost just £2.6 million. Nicholas Kove was born Miklos Klein in 1891 in a small Hungarian village then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His early years were shaped by conflict and upheaval. As a young man, he served as a cavalry officer during the First World War, was captured by Russian forces, and survived a Siberian prison camp with the help of Catholic priests. After the war, Kove worked for the short-lived communist government in Hungary, but when fascism swept through Europe, he fled with his wife, Clotilde, and their infant daughter, first to Algiers in 1922. Kove's journey across Europe was marked by a restless search for stability and a knack for invention. In Barcelona, he set up a small workshop making rubber-inflated toys, supplying Spanish toy shops with novelties. By the mid-1930s, he had moved to Milan, where he filed a patent for the interfix process, an early experiment in stiffening shirt collars with chemical treatments. This blend of textile know-how and emerging plastics would later prove vital. In late 1938, as war loomed once more, Kove arrived in London. He founded Airfix Products Limited in 1939, choosing the name to appear first in trade directories and to hint at his earlier work with their air-filled toys. The company's first catalogue listed rubber beach balls and inflatable rings, all produced in a modest workshop on Hampstead Road. When the Second World War broke out, Airfix switched to making rubber goods for the British military, supplying gaskets, inflatable dinghies and training dummies for the Ministry of Aircraft Production and the Royal Navy. Wartime contracts kept the business afloat and gave Kove an intimate knowledge of materials shortages and industrial supply chains. This experience, built on exile and adaptation, would soon set the stage for an entirely new kind of British childhood ritual. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of Britain's industrial past. The war left Britain short of rubber, but not of ambition. In 1947, Airfix installed a Tosco hydraulic injection moulding press in its Earlsfield factory, the first of its kind in the country. This machine, imported from the United States, did not just change Airfix, it changed the entire British plastics industry. Instead of laboriously shaping rubber by hand, the new press could produce thousands of identical plastic parts in a single day, each one formed from cellulose acetate and cooled to a hard, glossy finish. The first target was the Humbrol pocket comb. By the end of 1947, Airfix had become the United Kingdom's largest manufacturer of combs, turning out over 1.2 million units that year alone. These lightweight, affordable combs flooded post-war shops and were exported across the Commonwealth. The shift from rubber to plastic slashed production costs and made possible a scale of manufacturing that would have been unimaginable just a few years before. Kove's decision to embrace stainless injection moulding was both practical and visionary. The technology allowed Airfix to respond to shortages, but it also set the stage for something bigger. Once you could mould a comb, you could mould anything: a tractor, a ship, a Spitfire. The Tosco press did not just make combs, it gave Airfix the tools to democratise model making, offering precision and affordability to a nation hungry for new beginnings after the war. This leap in manufacturing power would soon open the door to the company's most iconic creations. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of Britain's industrial past. In 1949, a simple request from Ferguson Motor Company set Airfix on an unexpected new course. Ferguson needed a miniature version of their TE20 tractor for showroom promotion, a run of just 50 hand-assembled models. The price, set at £2.11, reflected both the novelty and the painstaking labour involved. But when Woolworths, the high street giant, was offered the model, they balked at the cost. Their buyers insisted if it could not be sold for 2 shillings, it would not earn a place on their shelves. Faced with this ultimatum, Miklos Kove made a decision that would change British childhoods for decades. Instead of delivering finished tractors, Airfix would sell the parts unassembled, tucked into a clear polythene bag with a simple header card. This cut costs dramatically and allowed Woolworths to offer the kit as an affordable treat, right alongside pick-and-mix sweets and hit records. The Ferguson TE20 became Britain's first plastic model kit sold as a DIY project, a new kind of toy that invited children not just to own, but to build. The real breakthrough came in 1952 with the Golden Hind, a model of Sir Francis Drake's famous galleon. Priced at 2 shillings and again packaged in a polythene bag, it landed on Woolworths shelves across the country. Suddenly, model building was no longer a specialist pursuit. It became a pocket money ritual, a Saturday afternoon adventure that started with a bag, a set of instructions, and a handful of grey plastic pieces. Airfix had stumbled into the mass market, and the quiet revolution of the model kit had begun. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of Britain's industrial past. By the mid-1950s, Airfix was no longer just a maker of novelty toys or a pioneer of plastic combs. The company's catalogue began to swell, offering a dizzying array of kits that captured the imaginations of children, teenagers, and even adults. Aircraft, ships, tanks, cars, each new subject opened a window onto a different world. The introduction of multiple scales, from the accessible 1/72nd scale fighters to the imposing 1/24th scale bombers, meant that both beginners and seasoned hobbyists found something to suit their skills and ambitions. Figure sets joined the lineup, letting builders stage battles or recreate scenes from history on the living room carpet. What truly set Airfix apart was the magic of its box art. In the 1960s, illustrator Roy Cross became the unsung hero of British bedrooms. His paintings transformed simple cardboard boxes into portals of adventure. A Spitfire banking over the Channel, a Lancaster roaring through flak, a convoy braving the Arctic seas. These images weren't just decoration. They promised drama and detail inside, sparking the urge to build, paint, and imagine. Cross's work gave Airfix kits an identity that was as much about aspiration as accuracy. For many, the first thrill came not from the plastic parts, but from the bold artwork that seemed to leap off the shelves at Woolworths. Series launches came thick and fast between 1955 and 1965, with each new release feeding a growing appetite for variety. The first 1/24th aircraft kits appeared in the late 1960s, offering a new level of complexity for those ready to take on a challenge. By broadening its range and investing in visual storytelling, Airfix didn't just sell models, it offered a rite of passage. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of Britain's industrial past. By the end of the 1960s, Airfix was operating on a scale that few British toy companies could match. The company's annual report for 1969 to 1970 recorded a staggering output, close to 20 million kits produced each year. In factories at Hull and London, injection moulding machines ran day and night, turning out sprues of Spitfires, Hurricanes and Destroyers by the thousand. Every week, lorries left the loading bays bound for Woolworths and high street shops from Aberdeen to Penzance. The reach was not just national. Airfix kits travelled to Canada, Australia, South Africa, and across Europe, carried in suitcases and shipping crates, spreading the ritual of model making far beyond British shores. The numbers tell only part of the story. In Britain, Airfix was everywhere. Kits filled the toy aisles of Woolworths and corner shops, stacked in cardboard displays, their bold box art promising adventure and history in a pocket money package. For countless children, the Saturday routine was as familiar as the smell of polystyrene glue. A walk to the shops, a careful choice between a Spitfire or a Sherman tank, and then the slow, absorbing task of assembly at the kitchen table. The Airfix Club magazine, launched in the 1960s, brought young builders together, sharing tips, competitions, and a sense of belonging. Even those who never joined the club often kept the magazine's pages as a kind of badge, proof of a shared obsession that crossed class and region. At its height, Airfix was not just a brand, but a fixture of British childhood. The company's output filled bedrooms, attics, and school halls, turning small hands into engineers and dreamers. This was the golden age, a moment when a simple plastic kit could link a generation, and when the hum of the moulding machines seemed destined never to stop. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of Britain's industrial past. In 1971, Airfix's board made a decision that would define the next decade: the purchase of Meccano Limited, along with the Dinky Toys brand. On paper, the deal looked like a masterstroke. 3 classic British names under one roof, promising a toy empire that could span generations. The aim was to smooth out the seasonal swings of model kit sales by adding Meccano's steady demand and Dinky's cachet in die-cast vehicles. But the reality proved far more complicated. The acquisition was financed with a mix of company cash and a sizable bank loan. Airfix's reserves, built up during the boom years, covered part of the cost, but the rest came from a 5-year loan at a steep 12% interest, typical for the inflation-ridden early 1970s. The company's annual reports show loans and overdrafts climbing from £350,000 in 1970 to about £650,000 after the deal. That extra £300,000 in debt hung over the balance sheet, and repayments were pegged to the hope that Meccano and Dinky could quickly boost turnover. Inside the company, not everyone was convinced. Trade press at the time recorded rumblings of dissent among senior managers, worried that the new burden would stretch Airfix's resources thin. Analysts in the Financial Times wondered aloud if the group's cash flow could keep pace with the rising costs and debt repayments. Shareholders too began to question whether the company's golden age could survive such a gamble. The numbers told a stark story. By the late 1970s, Airfix's debt-to-equity ratio had more than doubled, and the group was consistently operating with negative cash flow. The acquisition, once hailed as a bold expansion, became a ticking clock, a financial weight that would drag Airfix towards an uncertain future. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of Britain's industrial past. On July the 31st, 1981, the Airfix Group entered receivership, ending decades of near-constant production and sending shockwaves through Hull and the wider British toy industry. Outside the factory gates, workers gathered to read redundancy notices pinned to the doors. The administrator's report, issued that summer, laid bare the scale of the collapse. Debts outstripped assets, wages had gone unpaid, and the once bustling lines of injection moulders had fallen silent. Within weeks, the Airfix name passed into the hands of General Mills, an American conglomerate better known for breakfast cereals than model Spitfires. The new owners poured in capital and shifted strategy, chasing blockbuster tie-ins like the AT-AT from The Empire Strikes Back, but struggled to bridge the gap between British hobby tradition and corporate American management. Production continued, but the heart of the company felt adrift. By 1986, General Mills decided to cut its losses, selling Airfix to Humbrol, a British paint and hobby firm based in Hull. Humbrol moved quickly to rebuild trust among loyal customers. That year they launched the Flying Hours loyalty scheme, offering free kits in exchange for tokens collected from boxes, a small gesture that rekindled a sense of community among model builders. Humbrol's stewardship brought a degree of stability, but the rescue was only partial. The underlying challenges, rising costs, changing tastes, and the fragility of supply chains remained unresolved, setting the stage for future turmoil. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of Britain's industrial past. The summer of 2006 brought a crisis that few at the Hull factory saw coming. Airfix's longtime paint supplier, Hella SA in France, suddenly went into insolvency. Overnight, the steady flow of essential paints and materials stopped. Humbrol, Airfix's parent company, was already stretched thin. Without Hella's supplies, cash flow dried up fast. On the 31st of August, the directors filed for administration. By the next day, Grant Thornton had been appointed as administrator, and the news hit the workforce with brutal speed. Of the 41 employees at the Hull site, 31 were made redundant almost immediately. The notice was final and public, leaving just a handful to keep the lights on while the administrators assessed what could be saved. For the people of Hull, who had weathered decades of change and uncertainty, the closure felt personal. Generations had passed through the factory doors, building not just plastic kits, but a sense of pride and belonging. Now, with the future of Airfix uncertain and the familiar hum of production lines silenced, the model empire that once seemed unbreakable stood on the edge of oblivion. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of Britain's industrial past. On the 10th of November 2006, Hornby Hobbies stepped in with a deal worth £2.6 million that would decide the fate of Airfix. The purchase included not just the brand and its catalogue of moulds, but also the Airfix Club and the intellectual property that had defined generations of British childhoods. For the workers and the wider community, the news offered relief. At least the name would live on, even as the familiar routines of the whole factory came to an end. The reality on the ground was more final. In 2008, the old Hull site was demolished. Local newspapers recorded the last days of the building, steel frames twisted down, bricks carted off, the empty floor swept clean for new housing. The echoes of decades of production, the smell of polystyrene and glue, faded into memory. Airfix, once a fixture of Hull's industrial landscape, survived only in the kits on shop shelves and the stories passed down through families. Hornby's move ensured that Airfix would not vanish entirely. The brand was rescued, but the place that had shaped its identity was gone. The baton passed to a new era, with design and heritage preserved, but the original factory now only a memory. Subscribe for more stories from the heart of Britain's industrial past. Airfix survives. It is now designed in Britain, made in India, and owned by Hornby. Its legacy is etched in millions of British childhoods. As screens replace glue and paint, the ritual of making still shapes imaginations, echoing Miklos Kove's unlikely journey from Hungarian refugee to cultural pioneer. The question endures: what else of Britain's shared past do we risk losing to time? Subscribe for more stories that shaped generations.